Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry. Today's topic is going to be Catholic teaching on labor, private property, and wealth. Kind of a hot topic in today's political turmoil, especially when you have those capitalists on the right who are very much against labor rights and regulations, and they feel that the more regulations that you have, the worse it is for society, and kind of emphasizing, if they have more tax cuts and tax breaks, that they'll be able to accumulate more wealth and that everybody else will become wealthy along with them. Well, as we could see from history, that has never really been the case. But on the other side, we have socialists, and as we know, socialism leads to communism, as Vladimir Lenin once said. They think that all of the world's problems come from greedy capitalists who don't share, and they only utilize people as cattle so they can accumulate wealth. So in turn, they instigate the masses who are being oppressed by the capitalists and forced to pay the most of the tax burden and do all their work and receive as little wages that enough to survive and not much more. So therefore they instigate them to be angry at their employers and the capitalists. So they instigate class warfare, and there's a big struggle between the haves and the have-nots, between the rich and the poor, the capitalists and those who just want nothing more than equality and a chance to succeed in life. So are those the only two options? What does the Catholic Church teach about wealth, labor, private property, and so forth? Because with communism, there is no private property. So are they right? Did God create the heavens and the earth and say it's equally to be distributed equally among all people, regardless of the choices they make, what they do? Just by virtue of being a person, you have equal access and rights to property and wealth, or is there more to it than that? So let's dig in. I'm going to be reading an encyclical from Pope Leo XIII called Rerum Novarum, issued May 15th, 1891, on the right of private property, just reward for labor, and the right of entering private unions. Okay, let me begin. I'm going to read a paragraph, and then I might go back and make commentary on some of the highlights of the paragraph. Quote, "The right to possess private property as one's own is granted man by nature, nor is there any reason why the providence of the state should be introduced. For man is older than the state, and therefore he should have had by nature, before any state had come into existence, the right to care for life and body, for those things which are required to preserve life, and especially to make life complete. The earth, to be sure, pours forth in great abundance, but it could not pour it out from itself without its cultivation and care of man. Now, when a man applies the activity of his mind and the strength of his body to procuring the goods of nature, by this very act he attaches himself that part of corporeal nature which he has cultivated, on which he leaves impressed a kind of form, as it were, of his own personality, so that it should by all means be right for him to possess this part as his own, and by no means should anyone be permitted to violate this right of his. So obvious is the force of these arguments that it seems amazing that certain ones who would restore obsolete opinions should disagree with them. These, to be sure, concede to the private person the use of the soil and the various fruits of estates, but they deny openly that it is right that either the soil on which he has built or the estate which he has cultivated be owned by him." Close quote. Okay, so he begins right away. Pope Leo XIII begins by appealing to natural law. He says, by nature, human beings have the right to possess private property. In fact, if you understand the Ten Commandments, the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," assumes that private property is a part of God's creation. In fact, the Ten Commandments really are based on natural law, if you really think about it. But I don't want to go off on a tangent on that or digress in that direction. So, Pope Leo XIII, he says that because man is older than the state, that he has precedent over the state, and therefore he has the right by nature, before any state had come into existence, to care for his own life and his body. So in order to care for your life and your body, and also that of your family, you need to have somewhere to live, something to eat, and clothes to put on your body, and you have to be able to use the things of nature and of creation to maintain your life. That's just the way it is. No one's going to do it for you. You have to do it yourself. That was the case before there was such a thing as government. So, with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and all of their brothers and sisters, you have a family and you don't have the state. So the family comes before the state. And he says that the state has no right to interfere into the family because the family came first. God created it that way, right? And he says, Leo XIII says that a man, he cultivates, the soil. Making a garden, producing fruit, vegetables, things to eat. He uses the things of the soil, mud, bricks, wood, and so forth, to make houses, stones. And that is his duty, to take the things that God created and to do good with it, to provide for himself and for his family. That seems fairly simple, right? So God didn't create the government and then said, that was first, and that, every human being has the same right to each, an equal allotment of land. It's not how it went. Obviously, those who are more productive are going to be able to use the creation in a more productive way. But the question now is, does he do that for a selfish way, to hoard the things of creation to despite his fellow man? And we'll get to that shortly in this encyclical. So let's go on. Next paragraph. Quote, "Indeed, rights of this kind, which belong to men individually, are understood to be much stronger if they are looked upon as appropriate to and connected with his duties in domestic and social life. This right of property, then, which we have demonstrated to have been assigned to an individual person by nature, though which he is the head of the family, ought to be transferred to man. Rather, that right is so much stronger as the human person embraces more responsibilities in domestic and civil society. The most holy law of nature is that the father of a family provide with training and livelihood all whom he has begotten, and likewise it is deduced from nature herself that he seek to acquire and prepare for his children, who bear and continue in a way the father's personality, that by which they can honorably protect themselves from a wretched fate in this uncertain course of life. But this he cannot effect in any way other than by the possession of lucrative property to transmit by inheritance to his children. To wish, therefore, that civil government at its own option penetrate even to the intimate affairs of the home is a great and pernicious error. The power of the father is such that it can neither be destroyed nor absorbed by the state. Therefore, when the alleviation of the masses is sought, let this be enduring, that it must be held as fundamental that private property is to be inviolable." Closed quote. Okay, so lots of good stuff here. That the head of the family is the man, the husband, the father, right? That's clear from the scriptures, and it's clear from nature. Nature and the scriptures, meaning God's will, is hierarchical. It's not egalitarian. So notice how he says that it is the duty, the most holy law of nature, the most holy part of the natural law is that the father of a family provide with training and livelihood all to whom all he has begotten. So by right, the children, the mother produces the children, but the father being the head of the wife, the husband being the head of the wife, the children belong ultimately to both parents, because children do have to honor father and mother, but ultimately it is the father's duty to instill the right beliefs and the right values to children so that the children can imitate the father in teaching their children. And that's for the daughters and the sons. So that's his responsibility to be a provider, and it's according to his nature. So notice that there's no egalitarian footing here. It doesn't say father and mother. The father's job is to provide. Of course, now in our feminist society, there is actually competition. If a woman doesn't make as much money as a man doing the same job, it's just such a major injustice. And in a way, that's understandable. If you could do the same job and be this equally productive, then you should get paid the same. That's just. But ultimately, it's God's will that the husband be the provider. It's more according to his nature. Because now, who's going to take care of the children if the mother is working? You have to get a babysitter. You have to pay somebody else. Maybe they're state-sponsored daycare. Somebody else is raising your children, not you. And in some cases, you have extended family, which is great. But ultimately, the ideal situation is the husband being the provider. And the nourisher of the home is the mother and the wife. And also notice Pope Leo XIII, he refers to nature as herself. He says, it is deduced from nature herself that he seek to acquire and prepare for his children to bear and continue in a way the father's personality. So the father's personality is to rub off on the children. But he refers to nature in the feminine. So why is that? So a little short lesson in natural law here. Males and females are fundamentally different according to nature. That's how God created them. Not only with our anatomy and the wiring of our brains, but just our nature as our functional nature, right? So you have the male gives, the female receives. The male acts upon, the female is acted upon. It's passive. So, the earth is in the feminine because the earth receives the sunlight and the rain. The sun is always masculine, and the moon is in the feminine, and the rain and the weather is always masculine. Now, when you get into like the mythology and the pagan religions, then you have actually male and female deities, where you have the earth goddesses, fertility goddesses of the earth, and the storm gods, and the sun god is always male. And that's not because they're real, it's just because at least they had an understanding. They might have worshipped nature, as separate divinities, but they had an understanding of natural law, of males acting upon and females being acted upon, giving and receiving. So that's just a little extra credit tidbit there. That's why we say Mother Earth and those kind of things. It's not always pagan when you say Mother Earth. It represents the feminine nature of the earth being the recipient of other parts of the nature, namely sunlight and rain and so forth. Okay, continuing, Leo XIII says, he's actually indirectly, he is referring to socialism, because private property is kind of a big deal, and that's one of the injustice cries of socialism. The socialist is saying that the property and wealth needs to be redistributed equally among all people, so that way there will be justice and fairness. The problem with that is that even if you were to redistribute all land and wealth, and everybody has equal, starting back at the finish line, or at the starting line, 10 years later, the same people who are rich now are pretty much going to be rich again. And the same people who have accumulated more lands will accumulate more lands again, because some people are just naturally more prudent and skillful with creation than others. Yes, there are injustices where people don't get a fair shot. I'm not denying that. but a lot of it is decision making and being able to make wise decisions. Of course, some people are in a better situation where they can more easily make wise decisions, not saying that it's equally fair and everybody really has equal opportunity at all times, but life is kind of like that. In a fallen world, nothing is going to be as it ought to be, and you can't force it either. Forcing it only makes it worse. So he says, to wish, therefore, that the civil government, at its own option, arbitrarily, penetrate even to the intimate affairs of the home, he says, is a great and pernicious error. Right? So, for example, if in today's time, where if a family, a traditional Catholic Christian family, or even doesn't have to be a Christian family necessarily, they just have traditional beliefs, but that may infringe on the perceived rights of somebody who sees things differently. Then they'll go into your home and say, and maybe accuse the parents of abusing their child by not teaching them to accept everybody's opinions equally, everybody's sexual orientation equally, everybody's beliefs, political beliefs equally, everybody's religious beliefs equally. Oh, you're not teaching fairness and equality across the board. So then the government comes in, they try to censor your speech, they try to accuse parents of abusing their children, they try to force businesses to accommodate immoral people, even though they should have the right to refuse service to anyone, and so forth. So when the government goes into the affairs of the private home and tries to force families to acquiesce to ideas they don't believe in, that is government overreach. The state is going beyond what its duty is. So then he goes back to the power of the Father. The power of the Father is such that it can neither be destroyed nor absorbed by the state. So the authority of the Father over the family takes precedence and priority over the authority of the state, even. Right? And that's the Father's being criminal. And the state can't just arbitrarily say that the Father's being criminal just because the state has laws that are immoral. So the state is subordinate unto the church, and in a way the state is subordinate unto the father, the head of the household, because the family unit is the foundation of any civilization or society. Okay, next paragraph. Quote, the just possession of money is distinguished from the just use of money. Very important. To possess goods privately, as we have seen above, is a natural right of man, and to exercise this right, especially in the society of life, is not only lawful but clearly necessary. But if indeed this is asked, of what nature must the use of goods be? The Church answers without hesitation, as far as this is concerned, man ought not to hold his exterior possessions as his own, but as common, so that one may easily share them with the needs of others. Therefore, the Apostle says, charge the rich of the world to give easily, to communicate. 1 Timothy 6:17 and following. No one certainly is ordered to give assistance to others from that which pertains to his own use, and that of the members of his family, nor also to give over to others what he himself needs to preserve what befits his person, and what is proper. But when sufficient care has been given to necessity and decorum, it is a duty to assist the indigent from what remains. That which remaineth give alms. St. Luke chapter 11, verse 41. These are not duties of justice, except in extreme cases, but of Christian charity, which of course it is not right to seek by legal action. But the law and the judgment of Christ are above the laws and judgment of men, and he is in many ways urges the practice of almsgiving, and he will judge a kindness conferred upon or denied to the poor, as if conferred upon or denied to himself. Matthew 25, verse 34 and following. Close quote. Okay, lots of good stuff there. There's a good balance here. So he begins kind of continuing from what's already been said, that the just possession of money is distinguished from the just use of money. He begins with that. So you do have the right to make money and to possess it, and it's just. but it's not exactly the same thing as the just use of money. So obtaining money and property and using them are two different things. Okay, he's making a proper distinction here. Very good Thomistic theology going on. Okay, so he says, to possess goods privately is a natural right of man. All men have a natural right from God to possess goods. We've already established that. And to exercise this right, especially in society of life, he says it is not only lawful but clearly necessary to possess private goods. But he says, if indeed is asked of what nature must the use of goods be, the church answers that a man not ought to hold his exterior possessions as only his own, but as common, and that one may easily share them in need of others. So somebody might say that and say, ooh, see, Pope Leo is teaching socialism, that it doesn't belong to himself, it belongs to everyone. That's not what he means by common. It just means that because all of the earth belongs to God, and he allots certain men certain possessions of the earth, but the possessions that a man has is to be used for what his family needs, but if he has excess, then the excess is to be used to help others. That's all it is. Then he quotes scripture saying, charge the rich of the world to give easily, to communicate. So those who have been given much are expected much, right? To he who has much been given, as much is expected. And God will judge them by that, right? So the church teaches that no one is ordered to give assistance to others, that, and especially if you need something for your family, necessities, food, clothing, shelter, those kind of things, and even up to a certain extent, certain leisure, because leisure is good, but not to abuse it, right? So if you have excess, if you've seen the movie Dumb and Dumber where they're wiping their snot with $100 bills, that's excess, right? Obviously, that could be put to good use. So Pope Leo says, when sufficient care has been given to necessity and decorum, it is the duty to assist the indigent or the poor from what remains. Then he quotes scripture again, that which remaineth give alms, Luke 11:41. But interesting that Pope Leo does not say, he says this is not the duty of justice to give to the poor. Interesting, right? So sorry, social justice warriors, Pope Leo is not on your side. He says, except in extreme cases. Right. So normally, thinking inside of the bell curve, giving to the poor is not an act of justice, it is an act of charity. So charity is different than justice. What is justice? Justice is giving to another what is due, right? The things that a person owns that he has earned properly, without committing crime of theft or fraud or anything like that, that by right, that belongs to the person. Right? The things that a man has, even if it's excess, it is not due to another. Therefore, it is not justice that a man has to give to another, but it is an act of charity. So what are the three great theological virtues? Faith, hope, and charity, right? Love, an act of love. If you love God, you will love your fellow man. You can't say, I love God and hate your neighbor. And, the second greatest commandment, underneath the first one is love the Lord thy God with all of your heart, mind, and strength. Second one is love your neighbor as yourself. So if you see your neighbor, freezing cold in the winter, and you have two jackets, and you just tell them God bless you, and you have your two jackets, and you're actually sweating inside on a cold day, while your neighbor has got a little tank top on and he's shivering, trying to keep warm. Shame on you. You have two jackets. Give him one. That's charity. It's not justice to give him one. You don't have to. You don't owe it to him, but you should, because that's what God would want you to do. It's charity. If you were cold, you would want someone to do it to you. That's the golden rule. So there's a difference between justice and charity. Then he says also, it's not right to seek charity by legal action. So if the state is forcing you to give away your excess, that is not, that's actually violating someone's rights. The state should encourage you to give to others. So like in America, we actually have something called a tax deduction when you give to charity. So through our tax codes, you're actually being rewarded for giving to charity. Now, I know there are a lot of people that are corrupt and they give to their own charities and use a tax break for it, or they donate to some charity that they know is a hustle and they know it's a racket and they use it only for tax purposes. That's abuse. That's obviously wrong and immoral, unjust, and all that. But the purpose of the tax deduction is to encourage almsgiving and charity, which is a good thing. I think that's great. Why not encourage it, right? And if a person is taxed unnecessarily, overtaxed, then he has less to give to charity, right? So the problem is when people do hoard wealth and resources and they refuse to give to charity, and then people are suffering because people refuse to give to charity, then this would be one of those extreme cases that Pope Leo talks about where the state might have to raise a tax to take care of a necessity. Now, we're not talking about funding unnecessary wars. We're not talking about some pet project, money given to Planned Parenthood to kill unborn babies, and those kind of things. We're talking about actually helping the poor where the money actually goes to help the poor. And as anyone who's followed politics in this country, in America, we sadly find out that oftentimes the money that is used via taxation to help the poor often never gets there. So sad. Okay, now getting into labor unions and so forth. So this is kind of a touchy topic, but let's see what Pope Leo has to say in the year 1891, before the labor unions were taken over by socialists in the 1930s. Quote, "Labor, by nature, has, as it were, placed two marks upon man, namely that it is personal, because the driving force inheres in the person, and is entirely his own by whom it is exercised, and it comes into being for his own advantage. Then that it is necessary. For this reason, because the fruit of labor is needed by man to guard life. Moreover, the nature of things bids us to guard life, and especially we must obey nature. Now, if labor is considered only from this viewpoint, that it is personal, there is no doubt but that it is sound for the worker to prescribe a smaller rate of pay. For just as he offers his services of his own free will, so too of his free will he can be content with a slight pay for his services, or even no pay at all. But the case is to be judged much differently if with the reason of personality is joined with the reason of necessity, separable from the former, to be sure in theory, not in fact. Actually, to continue in life is the common duty of every individual, for whom to lack this persistence is a crime. Therefore, the right to discover that by which life is sustained is born of necessity, and the means to obtain this is supplied to all the poor only by the pay for his labor which is in demand. So granted that the workman and employer freely agree on the contract, as well as specifically on rate of pay, yet there is always underlying this something from natural justice, and this greater and more ancient than the will of those who make the contract, namely, that the pay must by no means be inadequate to support the worker, who indeed is frugal and of good character. But if the worker, forced by necessity or moved by fear of a worse evil, accepts the harder condition, which, even if he does not wish it, must be accepted because it is imposed by the employer or contractor, this certainly is to submit to force, against which justice cries out. If the worker obtains sufficient pay so as by it to be able to sustain himself, wife, and children comfortably, he will without difficulty apply himself to thrift if he is wise, and he will bring it about, as nature herself seems to urge, that after expenses are deducted, some be left over whereby he may obtain a moderate estate. For we have seen that the case which is being discussed cannot be solved by effective reasoning, except by this assumption and principle, that the right to private property must be held sacred. Nevertheless, these benefits cannot be attained except by the enormity of contribution and taxes. For since the right to possess private property is granted not by the laws of man, but by nature, the authority of the state cannot abolish it, but only temper its practice, and order it to the common good. Therefore, it would act unjustly and inhumanely if it should detract from private property more than is just under the name of taxes. Close quote. So that's kind of a long paragraph, a lot in there. So let's go back, let's walk it back a little bit. So he's going into labor now, work. Labor by nature has placed two marks upon man. He says that it is personal and that it is necessary. So the personal aspect is that a person's work should fit their personality. So if somebody is a brainiac, pencil pusher, and maybe he's kind of weak and with a slim build and sickly, not strong, he might not be a longshoreman or a steel factory worker. That might not be the best profession for him, or an infantryman or something like that, because he wasn't created to do that, right? And if on the other side, if somebody is highly intelligent, or I mean, if somebody is not highly intelligent, not naturally, not a great IQ, but has an able body and he has good work ethic, then he might be a good infantryman, a dock worker, or a factory worker. He might be able to do that. Maybe it's not his nature, to be a manager, not his nature to be an officer in the military. He's to be a grunt, because all these are necessary positions, and God creates each individual with a certain nature, and a person should know themselves. So they should know their own nature, know their strengths and weaknesses, and they should seek labor that befits them. And of course, according to the need to provide for family. So that would go under necessity. So the personal part is what kind of work befits the individual. So he says, Pope Leo says, if personality is the only thing that labor is about, then wages don't matter. So he says there are two aspects. The other aspect is necessity. He, as the father, he has the necessity to take care of his family and provide for them and to continue the family line, right? And to have private property and possessions. So that's a necessary thing regarding work. So for that reason, he needs to have adequate pay, and as far as the supply and demand go, supply and demand and free enterprise, those are all things that are natural. That's the natural economy, 101 stuff. So according to what kind of quality work he does, and according to the manner of work that he does, the mode of work, and how good he is at it, he ought to be paid accordingly, according to the kind of work that he does. And a good employer will treat the employees well, and they'll be paid well enough to be able to have a family life. Okay, so those are pretty simple principles. So if it was necessity only and not personal, then you have a high rate of labor, and even if the worker doesn't do the work, that's work without the personal aspect of it. So both are necessary. There's a balance to it. Okay, so he says to continue in this life is the common duty of every individual. So to continue in life, and you can't continue in life if you don't have any money, if you don't have any way to take care of your family. So to interfere with this, to interfere with the continuation of life and labor, to lay people off unnecessarily just so you can make a little bit more money, that would be wrong. That would be immoral. If you were to keep a person's wages low and you could afford to pay them what you ought to pay them, that's immoral. In fact, the 1962 Catholic Missal, one of the 4 sins that cry out to heaven to vengeance is defrauding laborers of their wages. So yes, it is a very Catholic principle that workers be paid a just amount of money. It doesn't mean that you cripple the owner of the business just so you make more money either, because then you don't have a job and no one gets paid. So that would be unjust also. So supply and demand are a natural part of the economy. Okay, so then he goes into kind of a labor union issue here. He says, granted that the workman and employer freely agree on the contract, as well as specifically on the rate of pay, yet there is always underlying something from the natural justice, and this greater and more ancient than the will of those who make the contract, namely that the pay must by no means be inadequate to support the worker, who is indeed frugal and of good character. So that's important. There's a balance there. So the worker and the employer and the employee enter a contract. They agree. This is the work I expect of you. This is what you're going to get paid, and they agree. And it's also the responsibility of the worker, after they accept that agreement, to be frugal and of good character. So that means when you get your paycheck, you don't go to the casino and blow your money, and then you can't pay the rent, can't pay the bills. You don't go to the strip bar or you don't go to a bar and waste it on booze and women, and then you can't pay the bills. Not that married men should be doing that anyway, but I'm just giving examples. Good character. Frugal meaning good with money, wise. Don't go out and blow the money that you make and then blame your employer for not paying you more. That's wrong. So we have to make distinctions between needs and wants in life. What do we desire? What do we really need? So he says if the employer or the contractor forcibly makes conditions harder and doesn't give adequate pay, he says, with the 1962 missile, against which justice cries out. So he also says that the pay ought to be able to sustain the worker, the wife, and the children comfortably. And when this is met, then the worker will aptly apply himself to thrift if he is wise, and he'll be a good worker. Basically, if you treat your workers right, then your workers will respond and work good for you. And there is a reciprocal nature of service there. And it produces a good and a good-willed society when you have benevolent employers giving proper pay and benefits to their workers. It makes the workers happy that they have a good family life, and they come to work happy and they're more productive. That's how it works. That's what a good society does. So when you have employers or employees not fulfilling their end of the bargain, not being honest, not being fair and just in the rate of pay and the benefits, then it creates all sorts of problems. So greed and avarice, that one of the 7 deadly sins, that is a big problem in America with employers. And also the greed of the workers in some of the labor unions. They're unreasonably demanding sometimes. So it's not just one side or the other. So it needs to be a reciprocal, good-willed contract and a reciprocal service. Okay, but nevertheless, the rights of private property must be held sacred, right, for the worker and for the employer. And that the authority of the state cannot abolish the right to possess private property, only to temper its practice. So by temper its practice means the state does have the authority and the right to introduce regulations so that there are no abuses, either by the employer or the employee. And this is for the common good. So that also means, the state does not get involved with issues of private property, but it does regulate the economy and the labor laws so that there are no abuses of the worker or of the abuse of unions against the company. Because if the company goes bankrupt, then no one has a job, and then what good is a union then? Okay, last paragraph. Quote, "It is comforting to observe that society of this kind are being formed, generally, either composed entirely of workers or from both classes. Moreover, it is to be desired that they grow in number and in effective influence. For it is permitted man, by the right of nature, to enter private societies, i.e. unions. Moreover, the state is established for the protection of natural right, not for its destruction. And so, if it forbids the formation of associations of citizens, it clearly acts at odds with itself, since it itself, as well as private associations, come into existence from a single principle, that men are by nature social. Occasions sometimes arise when it is just for laws to forbid such societies, namely if they deliberately aim at something which is clearly at variance with probity, justice, and the welfare of the state." Closed quote. Okay, so that's it for Rerum Novarum. Okay, so Pope Leo XIII says it is the right of nature to enter into private societies, and that's another way of talking about labor unions, because he says it is a natural right that human beings are by nature social creatures, so we band together. So, and it wasn't uncommon in the biblical times either. Joseph and Jesus, being woodworkers and carpenters, they had trade guilds at that time. They were very likely in a carpenter or woodworkers trade guild. And they've existed for thousands of years. People of a common craft, they band together so that their craft can continue along with their livelihood. It's a good thing. So the problem is, he does give the exception. It can be just to forbid these societies or labor unions if they deliberately aim to do something against probity, justice, and the welfare of the state. So the problem is, labor unions began as a Christian protection of workers in Europe a couple hundred years ago at the Industrial Revolution. Ironically, it was the progressives and the liberals who were in charge of industry, right? The Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and so forth. They weren't right wingers. They weren't conservatives in the Christian sense. They were the progressives. They were the ones who wanted to exploit workers and make more money, right? So labor unions originally are a conservative thing to protect the workers against greedy employers and those who exploit them and abuse them. But after socialism took root in Europe, and then communism, hardcore communism, the capital C, with the Soviet Union and so forth, they infiltrated labor unions in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. I'm sure you've heard of Saul Alinsky, he worked not only with communists, he also worked with Al Capone and other mafia and gangsters, and they infiltrated the labor unions. So labor unions at one point became at variance with probity, justice, and the welfare of the state. And at times they used intimidation tactics to force companies and corporations to meeting their demands. It might or might not have been according to supply and demand. Maybe I'm not saying that they were completely unjustified for asking if the corporations are making 250 times the average employee. That's excessive. That would be more than what you need. So Pope Leo would say, when you have excess to that extent, you ought to give to your employees. But on the other hand, some labor unions take it to the extreme, and they want to actually gain the upper hand against the employers and have the employers working for them, which is unjust. So it's supposed to be a reciprocated contract to which both are helping each other. So obviously an employer needs workers to be successful in his company, and obviously the workers need to take care of their families. So if one side or the other is not, doesn't have the opportunity to be successful, there's big problems. So, you can't accept the government to bail out unsuccessful corporations or even government entities, government-owned enterprises and so forth. That would be improper. So you have to be able to arbitrate a contract that's beneficial and one that could be sustained and continue. So also, and I want to end on this note, I once read a sermon by St. Augustine on one of the Psalms where he talks about the nature and the duties of the rich and the poor. He says, the rich and the poor, I'm paraphrasing, the rich and the poor need each other. The poor need the rich to take care of them. With their excess, they could be charitable and help the poor survive and sustain life. And in the inverse, the rich need the poor to show them how to get to heaven, namely through humility, being humble, and being able to survive without having excess. Because when you read the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus, he warns the rich, woe to you who are rich, because you are filled now, but later you will be hungry, right? He says it's easier for a camel to go walk through the needle of an eye than for a rich man to enter the heaven. And the rich young ruler did not want to sell all his possessions and become a disciple of Jesus. That made him sad when Jesus demanded that from him. He walked away sad because he loved his possessions more. So there is a balance to it. So Jesus never anywhere says that it's wrong to be rich. None of the apostles ever taught that. The church never taught that. In fact, you can't help the poor unless you do have excess. So if everybody's equally poor, which is what socialism does, then you can't help the poor. You can claim to redistribute the wealth, take from the rich and give to the poor, but as Margaret Thatcher once famously said, the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. So people need an incentive to be profitable. People need an incentive to go to work, namely to enjoy the fruits of their labors, to have something to, that their work, have something to show for it through their labor. It's a good thing. So if we don't have wealth, then we can't help the poor. And if everybody's equally poor and the people who regulate and control the economy usually are not the ones who are poor, then you have injustice and you can't help the poor. And you have to rely on a government that can very easily become an oligarchy. It can be fascist, it could be a dictator, and it could be the Antichrist that can be the lord it over all, as Jesus said to the disciples, the Gentiles lord over everything. So I hope this helps. Please like, subscribe. Feel free to leave comments if you agree or disagree or think I could have added something. I'd love to hear from you. God bless you. In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen.